Thank you all for coming out tonight. And let me just say, great to be here at my local bookstore, Kepler's. This evening, I'm going to highlight two things. Most speakers get up and say they're going to talk about three things, they're going to make 3 points. I'm not that ambitious. Just two things I'm going to talk about. And in fact, these are two myths that die hard about Trotsky and his last years in Mexico. The first has to do with Trotsky's affair with Frida Kahlo. Most of you have heard about this. If you haven't read about it, maybe you saw the movie. I think it was 2004, the movie Frida, which dwelled on this. The myth that dies hard is not that the affair took place, because of course it did, and I describe the circumstances in my book. In fact, the myth is that Frida's husband, Diego Rivera, later found out about it, and that this led him to break off his relationship with Trotsky. That's a myth. That's the first one. The second myth has to do with a certain ice pick. And I should say, spoiler alert, Trotsky does not do well at the end of this book. The book focuses, as Megan said, on the last years of Trotsky's life in Mexico, so 1937 to 1940, with flashbacks, though, to pivotal moments in his earlier career as young revolutionary, great orator of the Russian Revolution of 1917, creator and leader of the Red Army, and then, of course, vanquished rival of Stalin. But let's start with Diego. It was thanks to Diego Rivera, the great mural painter, that Trotsky landed in Mexico. Stalin had routed Trotsky in the battle to succeed Lenin, who died in 1924, and then sent Trotsky into exile. He actually first went to Turkey. From there, from Turkey, Trotsky eventually moved to France in 1933, then to Norway in 1935, until the political pressure on the Norwegian government forced it to expel Trotsky. Now, what do I mean by political pressure? The first of the famous Moscow show trials took place in August of 1936. Leading Bolsheviks, or I should say leading communists, were put on trial for the most fantastic crimes, including assassination of Stalin himself, attempted assassination anyway, espionage, and so on. Trotsky was portrayed as the mastermind of a group of spies, wreckers, and saboteurs directing their operations from abroad. That trial, the Moscow show trial of August 1936, was the first of 3 such show trials, each one involving major political figures, each time with Trotsky serving as the chief defendant in absentia. So, with Norway wanting to be rid of Trotsky, the only country in the world that would take him was Mexico, thanks to its radical president, Lázaro Cárdenas, who thought it was the right thing to do, but also, crucially, thanks to the intercession of Diego Rivera, who called himself a Trotskyist. I say called himself advisedly, more on that in a moment, and certainly was hated by the Mexican communists. The decision by Mexico to grant asylum was controversial within Mexico, but nonetheless it happened, and Trotsky and wife Natalia arrived there in January of 1937. Diego and Frida allowed Trotsky and Natalia to reside in their blue house, the Casa Azul, in Coyoacán, then a suburb outside Mexico City. Now, of course, it has been incorporated into the city. Rivera was a vital source of funds for Trotsky in these first 2 years, selling off his paintings, and at one point even mortgaging his house in nearby San Angel in order to help raise money for Trotsky for 2 things. One, to support the household, just putting food on the table, but also, and of increasing importance, money for Trotsky's protection, to pay for guards, to pay for weapons, and so on. Diego and Frida were at Trotsky's side during the Dewey Commission hearings held at the Blue House in the spring of 1937, the Dewey Commission being the independent inquiry into the veracity of the Moscow trials, led by the American philosopher and public intellectual John Dewey. The Dewey Commission eventually, by the end of 1937, issued a verdict of not guilty. In other words, that the outrageous charges against Trotsky in Moscow had not been proved. It was after the departure of the Dewey Commission, in the spring of 1937, that Trotsky and Frida began their affair. Frida's extramarital liaisons were several. I wrote numerous here, and then I crossed that out earlier, and I put several, because I should point out they were nowhere near the number of her husband, who was a champion philanderer. Trotsky's relations with Frida became known to, and I talk about this at some length in the book. There's a separate chapter devoted to it about Trotsky facing old age, having this fling. The chapter title is Man of October. Trotsky's affair with Frida becomes known to Natalia. And for a while, in that summer of 1937, this threatens the Trotsky's marriage. They had a short separation that summer, exchanging letters back and forth, some with shockingly explicit sexual language on Trotsky's part. This is all true. I'm not trying to sell books. Some very, as my father-in-law put it, some naughty pages in this book. Trotsky sort of defying advancing old age, although at the time, interestingly, Trotsky feels he's getting old. He's 57. And in this day and age, we look back, 57 doesn't seem that old, certainly not from up here, it doesn't look that old. 57, but he's called the old man by his acolytes, and he very much is feeling that way at this time, beginning in the late 1930s. It was during that separation, Trotsky was staying at a hacienda about a 10-hour drive from Coyoacán. It was during that separation that Trotsky and Frida decided to call a halt. We're pretty certain about this. Now, there's absolutely no evidence that Diego found out about any of this, either at the time or later on, when the friendship between Trotsky and Diego began to disintegrate. Had Rivera discovered that Trotsky was having an affair with his wife, Trotsky, the great Russian revolutionary, Trotsky, Diego Rivera's hero, the man he had arranged safe haven for in Mexico, Diego might have ended Trotsky's life before Stalin's assassin had a chance to do so. Diego was famously jealous of Frida, just jealous generally, always threatening people with a gun in his hand. So I speculate here that had he found out, we would have heard some fireworks. Trotsky would have heard some fireworks. For now, the friendship between Trotsky and Diego remained strong. It was Diego who broke the news to Trotsky in February of 1938 that Trotsky's older son, Lyova, it's a nickname for Lev, like Lev Trotsky, Lyova had died in a Paris clinic after an operation to remove his appendix. We'll probably never know whether foul play was involved on the part of the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. Most books say, well, of course, they knocked him off. It's not clear. But what is clear is that Trotsky had to assume that this was the case. Trotsky's other children were by now all dead or had disappeared. A daughter, Nina, died of natural causes in the USSR, tuberculosis in the 1920s. Another daughter, Zina, died a suicide in Berlin in 1933. And younger son, Sergei, or Seryoja, was arrested in Moscow. That the Trotskys knew. What they did not know was that he was shot while Trotsky was in Mexico and still alive.